In the previous examples, we looked at how to create containers, how to assign floating elements and change some of their attributes, how to line them up with each other, and how to treat the container itself to better display what we want it to. We looked at the difference between absolute and relative positioning, and depending on your needs, you may probably prefer relative, which gives us a bit more flexibility. Although absolute has its needs sometimes and can be assigned as you see fit, it's just important to remember what the difference between the two is. What we're going to be doing next is creating a very basic layout from scratch with a header, a footer, a content area that's going to be leaning towards the left, and a sidebar on the right for additional secondary content. And we're going to do that from scratch, and we're going to do that using containers. So first order of business, we're going to start a new web page. HTML, create. There we go. You should always be adding the title of your document. We'll call this template. It's just good practice to do that. Next, we're going to insert layout object. It'll be a div tag. And again, first order of business, we'll create a wrapper. We want to start including some styling to this, otherwise it looks pretty generic and doesn't really serve much of a purpose. So select that div you just inserted. We can create a new styling here by right-clicking and selecting New. We're going to call this wrapper because that's the class that we've assigned to it. And what we're going to do in this case is create to a new style sheet file. It just keeps our HTML neater, and it's better when you're building a website to contain all your CSS in a separate file that you can call in. Next, we'll be asked to create this CSS file, and we're going to call it styles.css. We get this message because we haven't saved our document in HTML yet, but just click OK, it'll be fine. And now we are prompted to define the attributes in CSS for the wrapper tag. We'll start with box. We're going to give it a 960 pixel width value, which should match the layout of our Photoshop document. Padding, nothing. Margin, nothing. Oh, my mistake. Margin, of course, we want it centered. So we're going to use auto left and auto right. We'll apply it there, and we can see the changes right away. It looks fantastic. Let's go with that. So the first order of business is I'm going to insert my a header area into this document. So we can delete the placeholder text. Make sure our cursor is positioned where we want it, right between the wrapper tag, and insert a new layout object. We're going to call this header. We're going to create a new CSS rule for this. In styles.css, yes, okay. At this point, we'll start with our box. By default, we saw that our box will widen to as much as it's allowed to given the container it's in. So because our wrapper tag is assigned a value of 960 pixels wide, we don't really have to define the width. It'll just go to 100% unless we want it smaller. Really, the situation here calls for maybe a height. We'll give it a height value of about 180 pixels. Just to give it a bit of substance in there, and then we can add more things. Margin, for now, we just leave everything blank. And for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to assign a border to this box just so we can clearly see what it looks like. So we'll use a solid line, thin, and we'll make it red. And that will be our header area. Okay. And okay, and there we go. So this is our header area. Next, we want to insert our content area, and where it gets a little tricky is with positioning the cursor. So it's practically impossible to position your cursor with the mouse where you actually want it. So what I find helps, just click inside the container, and with the right arrow key on your keyboard, just move towards the right, and you'll see that the cursor positions itself a bit more nicely. Or even faster, you just position your cursor in the code where you want the next step to take place. We're going to insert another layout object called div again, and this one is going to be the content. We're creating a new CSS rule here. Here we're going to go back to box, and we're going to change the width to, let's say, 660 pixels. We're going to assign a border to this just so we can distinguish it on our example. And we're going to name it, color it, let's say, this color here. Apply. And OK. So here's the container we just created. And we're going to do our sidebar over here. And before we do that, I'm just going to add a few carriage returns just so we can see where our content area is going to go. Again, using our cursor, we can click towards the right. DreamWeaver isn't really good about that, but you can kind of assume that it's there because that's where the cursor is in the code. We're going to insert another layout object. This is going to be sidebar. I clicked OK a bit too soon, and now we don't have any styling on this, and it's not where I want it to go. That's not bad. We actually can look at how to change that without doing anything over again. So we need to create a new entry here in the CSS by clicking in the panel. We're going to call this sidebar. And now we can change the attributes. So if our content area was 660 pixels and our total width is 960, the maximum that I can assign this is 300 pixels without breaking the grid and the wrapper. So I'm going to assign a value of width 300, and again I'm going to assign color to this border. And maybe something there. Apply, OK. Now this should be over there, but it's not. Again, we're going to revert back to what we learned in the earlier videos. For floating, this has to float where? To the right. So let's add a little float action to this. Left. And this should always be floating. That's the sidebar. Oops, my mistake. I had sidebar selected and assigned the float left to that. So this has to float right. And this, the content area, if I double click it, allows me to float it left. Okay. Now it's not doing what I wanted it to do, which is basically have this assigned over there on the right hand side. It creates a carriage return. One thing you can't forget, that if you have a fixed width of 960 pixels and then you add a border here and you add a border there, those get added to the total value of your boxes. So even though this container is 600 pixels, it's actually 602 if I calculate the width of the border. So what I'm going to do to this one is I'm just going to shrink it down a bit. So sidebar, instead of 300, I'm going to make it 294, just to give it a little bit of buffer. more. Let's go with 290. There we go. So now we see that it's back in the right place. However, our red container here, which is the wrapper, is once again acting funny. It's not pushing all the way down. So if we click on wrapper, we'll add a property. We'll add overflow to visible. And what we need to do after the final tag is added in, remember to clear all the floating elements. We're going to add in one more div after the sidebar, and that's going to be for the footer area. Layout objects div. This is going to be footer. Okay. Now we have to assign some create a new entry for footer in styles.css. The box is going to be 960 pixels. We'll add a border to this as well. Solid, thin, we'll make this green. Apply. And we also want this to, do we want it to float? No, but we don't want it to carry the floating inheritance from above. So for clear, we're going to assign both. And check that out. Suddenly things are making sense again. There's just one thing that's still not the way we like it, and that's the wrapper, which should go all the way down here. And to do that, we just add that empty container, insert div. This is the clear fix. We'll add a new class for clear fix, and we will assign a value of clear equals both to this. Go to live view. We have some issues. So with the clear fix added here at the bottom, we basically have the layout that we're looking for. We can test it out now by just maybe adding in a bit more content and seeing how our boxes expand. Obviously, when we save this, we're not going to be keeping the border colors on because it looks kind of weird, but imagine now at this point you have your basic layout, and within these containers now you can insert additional containers. So let's say we want a box for our logo. New CSS rule, we'll call it logo, okay. And this box is going to be 200 pixels wide and maybe 85 pixels tall. And we're not really sure where we want to put it. We just want to make sure that it's not stuck right up against the edge of the page. So we're going to give it a margin on top of maybe 15 pixels. And on the left, we'll add another 35 pixel margin. So when we, and let's put a border around that so we can actually see it. So it'll be a dotted, thin, like that blue, apply, okay. And this is our content for the logo, and we can see the margin that we assigned it makes it go there. Now if we want a navigation area maybe to the right of it, same approach. Make sure your cursor is positioned in the right place. And we insert another div tag. This one we'll call navbar. Oops. And don't forget, this is going to be the container for our nav bar, not the nav bar itself. So we want to make sure we assign the right attributes. We'll click New. So nav bar. Okay. The box is going to be, let's put in 600 for now. And the height is going to be about 35. We can always change that later. Let a border, dotted, color navy blue. But this one, we want it to float to the right. And we also want it to have a bit of a margin on the right so it's not completely stuck right up against the edge of the page. We'll give it a top margin of 15 so it matches the logo. And we'll give it a right margin of about 25. Oh, not exactly where we wanted it to go. But let's see what we can change to get it where we need it to go. Now we want this to be at the same level as this. However, our logo doesn't have any float assigned to it, which causes this carriage return to take place. So what we can do is double click logo here, and in our box, float will be left. And if we click apply, we should see the change right away. And here we have a float left. Where is it? That's the nav bar. Oh, maybe clear left. There we go. The clear in this particular case is probably not very useful, so let's delete it. And there we go. We're starting to see the makings of a web page. In the content area, we can insert yet another div, and there shouldn't be any concern about the I have too many divs in my document. It's the fundamental building block of a page and allows us a lot of control over these elements, so don't worry about it. This is going to be main image, for example. Create a new CSS rule. Okay, and this container is going to be, if we know that 660 pixels is the total width of our window, let's make this one 630, and we'll have it centered in that box, so right and left margins are automatic. We'll add a bit of a border just so we can see it. Then let's make it nice. And let's give it a height also. So back to box. Let's give it a height of 400 pixels. And there it is inside our container. I guess we could get rid of these carriage returns. And this is where DreamWeaver starts getting a little annoying. If I want to put carriage returns under this box, it's hard to position the cursor, and you basically have to go into the code, div class content, main image, and now position your cursor there and insert some carriage returns. So DreamWeaver is fantastic, but there are just some things. There you go. Now you can add your cursor and add some more there. There are just some things that are just a little frustrating. Now I'm seeing that this container is a little stuck right up to here. I'm going to add another property called margin top. And make that 10 pixels, and it will help push it down. You can continue building your page like this and just keep on adding containers within containers. For example, in the navigation bar here, each button should technically contain its own container. This would be a button. for example. And we're going to create a new class for button. Ooh, no, let's call it nav button. Sorry about that. And we'll make it, I don't know, it's a 150 pixels wide and 25 pixels tall. We'll give it a border okay, and nothing happened here because we need to update the class in the code. So that's nav button. Refresh. There we go. So we'll just change the content in here so it's not too long. Oops. So we'll do this text. I'll say button 1. And what's good about this now is you can basically copy and paste. So in your code, div class nav button, grab that whole thing, copy, oops, copy, paste, 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 paste for as many buttons as you need, refresh, and you get this kind of business here. However, in your nav button styling, if you double click and go to box and float them all to the left. Now because they all share the same class of nav button, making the change to this one applies to all of them because they're all using the same class. So if I click apply, boom, they all get assigned the left float. Now obviously there's not enough space for all of them in here, so I can adjust the width to maybe half of that, 75 pixels. And there you go. I could probably bump it up to 100. And now I'm starting to get some interesting stuff happening there. Don't stop there. You can maybe just say, okay, for this button, I want to change the font. So now it's for Dana 1. Maybe I want to change the background color to something else. And maybe I want to change the margin, but only on the right, to 5 pixels. And that's going to start spacing them out. Maybe you want 10. It's up to you. You're the designer. So you would continue building your page like this, and it should match the structure of your Photoshop mockup, keeping in mind where all the containers should go, how they should fit in, where they relate to each other, and of course making sure that the dimensions are correct, and not forgetting that you're working almost in 3 dimensions, starting with your background image, and again you can assign divs over that background, which then itself can contain a background, which itself can contain text or an image. So don't forget how to stack your document to properly achieve the effects you're looking for, and you should be doing that at the Photoshop level when you're creating your design, looking and thinking about how it's going to be reconstructed using HTML and CSS. Thanks for sticking around. I'll add more of these videos based on the questions and feedback from the class, and we'll take it from there.